Hello and welcome to the second episode of the second series of AS for Architecture with me, Ambrose Gillick. A discussion today with the architect, writer and educator Pierre about his work, including his 2020 book, Dwelling on the Future, Architecture for the Seaside, Middle England and the Metropolis, published by UCL Press.
I did a project in the 90s called The Invisible House, which was about the densification of the interwar suburb in West London, which was making a sort of semi-sunken house in a back garden between semi-detached houses, and gave this example that could densify without loss of space. You could have your garden on the roof, and you could have communal use of it or private use of it. It could be used for a granny flat or a studio, and it could infiltrate suburbia by stealth, is how I put it.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome again to A is for Architecture with me, Ambrose Gillick. I'm talking today to Pierre Davoine. Pierre, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Yes, Ambrose, thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. I am an architect based in London, and I have been in practice pretty much on my own since 1979. Originally, I am from India. I was born and brought up in Bombay. I lived there till I was 11. Came to London in 1962 with my mother and sister. My father had died a couple of years before that. And I've lived in London ever since. Except for the moment when I went to study architecture, I went to Birmingham in the 1969 and did my undergrad there and my diploma, as it was called in those days, and had a great time in Birmingham. Still have good connections there, fond memories. But I came back to London in 1975. I say came back. I was always back in London visiting my family and friends. But I got a job working for a small practice in Richmond, Peter Bond Associates. And it was at the time of this oil crisis. And Peter, who had worked for Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew and had set up his office a couple of years before that on the basis of a large project for United Biscuits in West London. I mean, that project was basically stopped. So I got to Peter's office in probably July that year. And 2 months later, I was made redundant. And I spent a lot of my time, I was living in Twickenham with my wife, and I spent a lot of my time, taking apart and putting back together again a small terraced house in Twickenham. And then Peter invited me back to work with him on a 3-day week basis. And interestingly, he had been commissioned by Waits to design the first conservation house at the Centre for Alternative Technology at Machynlleth in Wales. I had a very peripheral involvement, but I've become more and more interested in that, and I think that had quite a big influence on me. But I left Peter's in 77 and then went to work as a contract staff member for Fitzroy Robinson and Partners on a building site on Blackfriars Bridge. They were building Lloyd's Computer Centre, very latter stages, and we worked on a sort of building site in a whole city of porter cabins. And I had a great time there and made lots of good friends, and just got involved in the latter stages of all of that, and quite enjoyed that. But I hadn't really been back to India for any length of time since I'd left. And I decided with my wife to travel in India, to go back and spend time there. So we went there for some weeks, probably some months, visiting friends, family, places. Up in the north, we went to places like Chandigarh, Agra. And then I came back to London, and I was set up in office, in practice, working from home. And having done that, we also had a daughter, and my daughter Pierre was born in '79, and just when I set up the office. My wife went back to work within 2 weeks, so I had this rather privileged time when I was looking after Pierre, for the first 6 months of her life. I had her pram by my drawing board, and balanced the two activities. It was really interesting. But I then had an office with friends in Fulham. We shared an office with Nigel Crump, Ingrid Morris, and my two associates, and were Julian Paltuck and David Connor, who had been at the RCA. And we worked together there. Then we moved our office to Chelsea Wharf, and we worked together there for about 3 years. We did a video post-production facilities project in Camden Town. But in the meantime, I'd found a large derelict property on the river in Mortlake. So I sort of withdrew from that association and set up the office in Mortlake. So my wife, who's an accountant, she and I lived in the building and worked in the building. And I suppose, just briefly to let you know, that I suppose I, partly because I'd studied at Birmingham, the architecture school, although it was part of Aston University, was in the art school. And we made lots of very interesting connections in terms of friendships and things. And through that, I ended up with an early career designing shops for fashion designers in London and in Tokyo.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. It's a beautiful introduction. And it touches on, I think, well, it makes me think of a number of themes. So I was delighted to get this edition of your latest book. Is it your latest book or your most recent book?
It's not my most recent. It's the second book I've done. I can claim authorship of a previous book called Housey,
yeah,
a pattern book of ideal homes, which I did with my now partner Clermont Hewish, who's an anthropologist. Mm-hmm. But we did Housey in 2005. Dwelling on the Future was published by UCL Press in 2020. Mm-hmm. I've just published a monograph on a project we did in Umbria in Italy. It's called San Salvatore House Pool Landscape. Mm-hmm. That's just been published. But it's a story of a single project with some wonderful photographs by David Grandorge.
Well, we're talking about Dwelling on the Future at the moment. I'd like to see that other one as well, and which has obviously got to focus again on housing and the way you've described your journey. I mean, there's so much intriguing stuff there, but there seems to be this, to me, and you can stop me if I'm wrong, your domestic realm has played an instrumental role in your development, I suppose, as an architect, moving into a house and doing it up, which is what I've done. And I'm sat in the roof at the moment of mine, but it looks nicer down below. But this is where I store spare insulation and spare plasterboard and things like that. And then this one in Mortlake as well, where you take a building and you turn it into a home. And I think that's perhaps, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, perhaps the inspiration that you have a fascination or have an interest in the idea of the domestic realm, of the dwelling place.
For sure. I enjoyed my period of time working on retail. That came about serendipitously. I had made no effort to engage in that, and it was fascinating. I worked mostly for Michiko Koshino, a Japanese fashion designer who'd been married to an Englishman, lived in London. I did a shop for her here, or them, in Mayfair, and then was invited by Michiko to work in Japan on a kind of whole range of things. And I worked also with Issey Miyake, and I worked for a large department store chain called Parco, for whom Nigel Coates, I think, famously had done the Cafe Bongo. And they were very enterprising. They liked the European architects because we came with different kinds of narratives for them, and I think they liked the stories that we could offer them, and so on. But I got, I suppose, slightly disillusioned, slightly hair shirt about the fast track nature of retail design. We would spend months designing something beautifully and realizing it beautifully with good contractors and other consultants. And then these shops had quite a relatively short shelf life. They could be ripped out within a couple of years. And I, as you said, I had an interest in housing because I had no, at the time, I had no great distinction between new build. There was very little opportunity for new build for me. So most of what I was doing in my practice, apart from the retail, was repairing, extending, altering existing houses in and around London. And we engineered an opportunity to make a small development in Richmond, on the site of an old instrument factory, which itself had been built on the site of a pair of semi-detached villas, and that had been bombed during the war. So we had inherited a planning permission where there was 6 flats with a common hall, which sat on the same footprint of the old factory. But we reinvented that as 6 back-to-back houses, and had interesting kind of scenarios about how you might deal with the interior volume while being quite respectful to its locale. It was a conservation area, and we had to be quite careful because the planners insisted on that. But it makes me want to say that, in terms of this shift from, working and doing things for myself to doing projects, houses for others, I see that as this kind of an imaginative moment. You have to make a connection, and you have to have a sort of empathy, even though sometimes you're not empathizing or having to deal with a specific client, but there's an empathy not just to people but to things and places that I think was, I kind of enjoy that, and I think that's been with me the whole of my career.
Yes. In the towards the end of the introduction to the Dwelling on the Future, subtitled "Architecture for the Seaside, Middle England, and the Metropolis," which is a wonderful subtitle, and it certainly caught my attention. You describe in the introduction, you say, the design of housing by definition means the design of places for other people to live in. It is an act of imaginative thinking and something done collectively. To accommodate the needs and desires of others requires empathy, and the architect can never be neutral and completely objective. And I thought this was really good because I've worked in practices where we've done a lot of domestic work, and it's something that we talk to our students about a lot. And it is in many ways the most complicated type of architecture to do when you're designing, particularly at the scale of the individual home for the individual client or client family or group, because it's so intimate, because you have to empathize and, as you say, be imaginative to their reality in a way that perhaps when you're dealing with more civic buildings or larger scale developments, you can sort of take people as an avatar. You can kind of have your cipher, your modular, whereas in the domestic realm, you really can't.
Yeah, but I think it's quite direct, the relationship, and it sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes you don't get on, and it happens occasionally where what you're trying to offer, what you have to offer, just doesn't chime with the client's expectations. And that can be quite tough, because I take a position where we can't be everything to everybody.
No.
There has to be some moment where you connect, and you have some kind of frisson, and you engage, and then things start to emerge. So in fact, it's never, I've been quite interested in discussing this notion of authorship across a series of lectures over the years, and I see these all architectural practice, I would argue, is collaborative, not just regarding the architect-client relationship, but with other consultants and contractors and so on, and even with the people in the office. I mean, just by way of example, the book Dwelling on the Future is the result of, for me, an incredible input from young students, or young architects who've contributed immensely to the sort of idea, not only just the kind of production of it in terms of drawings and so on, but also to the ideas about how things are placed and they come about. And that's kind of the most exciting thing, I think, going into a project not knowing what the outcome is. And don't want to be disingenuous and say that after all this time I don't have strong ideas myself, but there's trying to find a kind of mode of practice in which one can accommodate other points of view. And I see my role as a synthesizer, somebody who does offer suggestions, but ultimately, in my office, I have to take a lead role in terms of how that all gets synthesized and put together. It doesn't get any easier, I must say. It's always a tricky, but exciting thing that it does. Yeah.
This and you make this point, I think, when you talk about, again, the beginning of the book, specifically talking about this idea of home and housing that is never just housing, that there's a kind of the home is part of a broader instrument of socialization, and that goes not just for the residents, but within it, but as you've described, sort of the socialization in a way of the practitioner themselves, that there's no space in a way for the sole author, the great fountainhead type approach to architectural housing, but the home itself is a component part of a network of kind of meanings and identities.
No, absolutely. And I suppose, having talked about having to empathize the other side of things, the more, if you like, the aspect which I would put into the stretch of history that is to do with modernism and its social ideals. I think I'm very aware of that. We don't just make architecture for the very rich anymore. No. There was a point at which which it could have taken place at New Lanark with Robert Owen, or the sort of company town, and so on, where you're living in Derbyshire, where you worked in Derbyshire, in the Derwent Valley, and in places like Belper, with the struts and so on. I think this idea that the spaces in which people live, although they ostensibly have a fairly, in a typical house, it's public rooms, living rooms, dining rooms, kitchens, bedrooms, bathrooms, if you like. But within that, the way people live their lives has been has maybe it always was, but it certainly has become much more fluid, and people have different demands and quite multifarious demands about how the space should kind of what the space should offer to them, and how the space can be used, adapted, and so on. So I'm interested in that in a fairly sort of, probably like most architects, we're aware that this is how it is. I'm also aware through my academic interests and through teaching, but even looking at Marc Girouard in the Life in the English Country House, things were very different in the 16th century. But when people like Fred Scott and Robin Evans teaching at the AA in the late 60s, early 70s, using Girouard's book as a kind of starting point for how you might think about people living together. It didn't have to be the nuclear family, it could be houses without corridors, rooms leading onto rooms, and what that might offer you, dipping back as far as someone like Fourier and the Phalanstère, and just an interest in different ways in which places can be combined to accommodate and suit people. That it's a kind of academic interest, but one tries to deal with this in through the work, and I suppose as you said, I feel it's not just about architecture, it's not just about housing. There's a whole host of attendant issues that come to bear on it.
It's complicated though, isn't it? Because once you've moved beyond that sort of, so you go to Birmingham to study, where you've got in the 1960s, which must have been a scene of quite considerable construction. I mean, there must have been a lot going on, and a lot of it must in that sort of post-war egalitarian moment, where they're sort of modernizing things and building motorways and lots and lots and lots of suburban housing and civic buildings of various kinds. That wonderful, particularly in the 60s. You've got this idea of a kind of objective kind of measure of what constitutes a good house, and as you sort of implied, things have changed quite radically. And we've moved away from that model of architecture where architecture is applied, good housing architecture is applied to people, particularly to poor people, or marginalized people, as we prefer to call people now, towards something that's much more subjective. And the question, I suppose, is how does one design in that context? How does one design, particularly at scale? So to get rather up-to-date and political about it, we have a housing crisis, which is requiring a vast quantity of building, even if retrofitting and rebuilding in the way that the normal domestic architect works on existing properties. How do you square that circle? Because it is a bit of a problem, isn't it, that we've moved away from this very kind of top-down approach to how to design housing, the sort of Parker Morris standards, that there's standard practices, standard ways of doing things, standard space sizes, ceiling heights, window proportions, so on and so forth, towards something that's much more taste and values driven. And I think that perhaps presents a great problem for the practice of architecture as a kind of objective borderline science. Like how do we engage with the client? Because you mentioned in one of the reviews of your book, I think it's where Dean Hawkes is writing a review of Dwelling on the Future. Or maybe it's in the book itself, I'm not sure. talks about a bottom-up approach to housing. Like, so how do you square this? How do you have a bottom-up approach to housing in a subjective age, a postmodern subjective age,
Yeah.
and
No, I
produce
think,
at scale?
yeah, no, that's something I think I talked about almost in the final few paragraphs of the book in my postscript, and Dean may have referred to it as well. And I feel that some of the projects in the book try and engage with this polemically, if you like, and offer ways in which to approach that. But if you don't mind, I found something I thought might be quite useful just to quickly read out for you.
Yeah, I'd love it.
It is something that I wrote like 20 years ago for ARQ on a lecture I gave. And it was, I cribbed some of this from the academic Hilda Heynen, who's French Belgian, and writing about the philosopher Ernest Bloch. And she said the whole is based on a philosophical ontology that understands being as essentially incomplete, according to Bloch. Being necessarily contains a moment of not yet being. In every manifestation of being, therefore, one can see a tendency towards the self-fulfillment of a utopian ideal for the future. I'll go on a little bit further, if I may.
Please do, yeah.
As stated earlier in the text, that is my practice, we took a position that considers the act of building itself as an act of anticipation. The basic theme of Bloch's philosophy is the still unbecome, still unachieved homeland, he calls it Heimat, as it develops outward and upward in the dialectical materialistic struggle of the new with the old. And this is then quoting Heynen. She says, according to Heynen for Bloch, Heimat is seen as the place where utopia is achieved, the homeland where human beings and the world are reconciled and where the dream of a better life is finally realized. The Heimat does not yet exist. Nobody dwells there. As children, we have all had a glimpse of it, an existence without deprivation, without alienation, without expropriation. The creation of this Heimat is the goal of all human endeavor. And I, in a slightly pessimistic way, I say that our dilemma as architects is how to build with an integrity that inspires to this notion of Heimat in a material world which is overwhelmingly pluralist and market-led. To satisfy one aspect of an architectural commission might cause dissatisfaction in another. Like the Big Bang theory of the universe, the paradox is that as choice in the global economy, like the Big Bang theory of the universe, is ever expanding, market forces and capitalist competition dictate that reduction of quality is implicit everywhere in the world that we inhabit. Not even the super rich can escape the environmental degradation that threatens the planet. The theme of this symposium was building simply, and I said, can a lone voice building simply make a difference in face of a dominant corporate client that is everywhere and nowhere? But what I wanted really, just because the situation is, my position is that, there are lots and lots ever expanding possibilities, but the way that the market controls or compromises our practice or one's practice means that ultimately there is very little choice. Vis-a-vis, you were talking about the kind of spatial formal arrangements that might construe as a result of how we how people might want to live. But in fact, the model is very basic. The model of the developer house is really quite limited, and the model of how you place that house either in a suburban context or in a small block. And I was also going to argue that my take on the period when I came to live in this country in the 60s, but having the welfare state established in the 50s and 60s, was it may have been some kind of social engineering that had been engaged with and imposed. But I feel optimistic enough and maybe naive enough to believe that people were doing a lot of that with the best intentions, trying to give disenfranchised families with very little income, living in very difficult conditions, some other possibilities with their lives in terms of how they could live in, not only individually in flats or houses, but in concert with one another. And I don't think it's been an overall success, but I have, my office is in the East End, where there are some really fine examples of work by Lubetkin and Tecton, the Smithsons, going back further to the LCC, Boundary Estate, and I think that there were some good examples, but I think we're now they've been vilified and demonized, and that it's allowed a certain kind of new development to take place,
yes.
which it's totally about the monetized, it's not the thing itself, but it's how it can make the client or make the developer money.
Yeah.
I might be
no, I don't think so. I mean, it's quite interesting. It's quite an interesting point, isn't it, that perhaps we might call it the left wing, to use a rather lazy sort of cipher, in that post-war period sought to generate a universal Heimat. And it was, wasn't it? I mean, it was a kind of idealism of taking people like, and we were talking before I started recording, my grandfather's family, and putting them in something that wasn't abysmal, which wasn't absolutely devastating to their personhood and their health, and giving them something better. But on the other end of the spectrum, you've got the kind of commercial house builders, which also operate in a similar abstract kind of way, producing housing which is not dependent upon a meaningful interrogation of what people need, let alone what they want. It's, as you say, driven by the market, and the market has become the dominant way that we kind of interpret things. But it's but this, I think this Hilda Heinen's discussion of blocks sounds to me to be fascinating. And your talk on it, this idea that what we're doing when we're doing domestic architecture is in a way what Joseph Reichwert calls creating Adam's house in paradise. We're recreating in our little way, or attempting to, some kind of Garden of Eden, where we are at peace with each other and at peace with nature and at one with the world. And domestic architecture pertains to that.
Yeah, in its purest, in its purest sense, I agree. Yes, I think the underlying, I think the underlying approach from architects, speaking universally, we all aspire to that. If one has a, faith in the good of humanity and human nature. So I believe in that, but I suppose the issue for me, and I talk a little bit about it in the book, that the issue of land and its availability is always something that is contested, and property owning becomes a dilemma when one is talking about that kind of ideal. But we have to somehow come to a compromise around that. And when you asked me earlier about the sort of bottom-up approach, I mean, there are projects in the book that I talk about, and collaborators with whom I've worked, and we've tried to discuss this and show, examples of how the organization of this might work, and just the kind of designed examples of how things might operate. So I don't know if these can be achieved without a kind of overarching legislation and accommodation within the bigger political system to let things happen. And I think more and more this isn't the case. And we've looked at, I was brought up sharp by Ian Abley, one of my collaborators on the Patchwork City. He said, this sort of thinking has been done by people like Thomas Sievert in Cities Without Cities. But we had the idea with the Patchwork City, which was really a critique of the Ebenezer Howard's Garden City, that it wasn't a self-contained, self-sufficient thing. We wanted to kind of stitch this into an existing context. In the case of the Patchwork City, we cited it in Bedfordshire, and connected it with a whole range of different systems and institutions to do with the economic system of the Oxford Cambridge arc, the landscape itself, the kind of infrastructure, motorway, the sort of declining kind of industrial elements, and most importantly farmland. And I think it was offered as a suggestion. There could be nothing imposed, and in fact we set up an association, or proposed that it was going to be called the Aspley Guys Patchwork City Association. But it, the profit margin was taken out of it, so that I would say that that houses were looked upon as homes and not investment. And we made simple suggestions, like for farmers wanting to sell their land for development, they couldn't, or they shouldn't look to their hope value, which sometimes multiplied the cost of the farmland by tens, if not more. We said it could be 4 times the cost of the farmland, and they had the right to sell or not. So it was couched in those kind of terms. And I worked with Ian Abley, and who's a sort of left-wing activist architect who had invented this thing called the 150 New Towns Club. I worked with an old student of mine, Alex Scragg, I taught at the Bartlett in 3rd year. And I also worked with my wife, Claire Malhewish, who's an anthropologist, and Nabil Hamdi, who had done a lot of, I think he's professor at UCL, and in the development unit there, development planning unit. But Nabil had written about this, housing without houses and so on. And so we tried to make a scenario where we could offer something quite complicated and complex, and it wasn't about just houses. We thought the houses were almost the least important thing. We offered pattern book examples, including our own Housey pattern book, but it could be anybody's. It was more about how this was all connected up, and the balance between, manufacture, the balance between, I taken the word agriculture out and offered the word horticulture, which implied a different scale of operation, more intensive and about the use of the hand and not the small scale machinery, not agri-industry. But there was all of that. But we've also proposed it, I think, in a much more direct way. I did a project in the 90s called The Invisible House, which was about the densification of the interwar suburb in West London, which was making a sort of semi-sunken house in a back garden of between semi-detached houses, and gave this example that could densify without loss of space. You could have your garden on the roof, and you could have communal use of it or private use of it. It could be used for a granny flat or studio, and it could infiltrate suburbia by stealth, is how I put it. And I worked that up into another project, which is in the book, which was for densifying, again, West London suburbia, but further out. But I called it House plus Garden plus House, a new suburban code for London. And it was just because we managed to get planning permission for the Invisible House in the London Borough of Ealing after a long struggle, where the planner said, "Over my dead body, will you get permission?" You know, and it went to appeal, and we got it eventually. But subsequent to that, there was legislation brought in, partly, I think, because of our project, but this idea that they restricted what they call garden grab. And so I was arguing that people should have the right to develop in their own back garden, if it was big enough. And you provide a suburban code that gives certain parameters for that without, so it's not a complete free-for-all, but it's kind of considered way in which people could do that. And not just about permitted development, but there are other ways to make houses in the back. And the premise for us was that a lot of what goes on in suburbia, again, is agglomeration of sites gathering together units to make larger sites, and then you do other kinds of development on that, and that the profit for that goes to the developer and the outsider. And the argument here is that why can't you have a kind of a scenario where individual householders can make, so it's within the capitalist system, that why can't they actually make money for themselves, or just do something that might, it could be short term, it could be long term. You could actually support a local economy through using smaller contractors to do this kind of work. And because there are other projects that I've designed that are about a kit of parts that could be customized and adapted using things that you could buy in the local DIY shop. And I suppose that project, I feel, also has legs, that it could
it's quite interesting, because I mean, I think you actually touched on this in the book, is that it's already happening. I mean, that's the thing with London particularly, but I suspect it's true of most large cities, if not in the UK, then certainly globally, where you've already got a second home in the garden. I stayed in one accidentally in London after giving a talk, and I hadn't got anywhere to stay, and someone said, "Well, you can sleep in the shed in the garden." And it was in Stockwell. The house was just a standard Victorian terrace, small, not a lavish one, not a jaunty one, a fairly plain, cheap workers' terrace. There were 9 people living in it. So in a strange kind of way, to come back to this kind of rather ephemeral idea of the dwelling, there were 9 dwellings in this one dwelling. And then the back garden, they had what they called a studio, which wasn't a studio. Someone was already living there. So if it's already happening, to not legislate for it just ensures that it's going to happen badly, and you will end up with some kind of wretched disaster, as you see particularly in the global south, where you get, informal developments, overdevelopment, and the fire risk goes through the roof because it's all jerry built, and so on and so forth.
No, I mean, that's the point I was making, that these things happen incidentally or illegally, and they could be done much better if they were just out there in the open, and if the mechanism allowed for, I suppose the example you've given is that somebody's built themselves an extension, a new property in their garden that's for them, their use.
Yeah.
But my thought was that, a family could build something in their garden, and they could offer that to another family to use. I mean, there's some of this thinking has come about because the project was in Feltham. It was done for a Punjabi family who happened to be my next door but one neighbors when I had my house in Twickenham in the early 70s. They're still good friends. And
well, it must have gone well as a project, so that's a start.
Yeah, but he works at the airport, and he took me to meet some of his friends in Southall and the West London hinterland around the airport, where these are people who are not young, middle-aged men who come from India, leave their families behind in places like Bhopal and so on, and live in somebody's garage for 9 months a year, and then go back to India for a break with their families. But the garages are not standalone. They share a yard with the existing house, which might be a semi or a detached or a terrace, and there's a whole network of dwelling going on there, which is not mean. I wouldn't call those places mean. I would say they were quite well set up, and people live in them respectfully, if you like. They're not playing games, and I think the kind of I took from that, Ambrose, and I suppose then it talks about different kind of cultures and how some cultures might be easily slip into that kind of mode, and other cultures may not, and that's also an interesting story to kind of engage with. But that, just to give you some background to how that came about, and that, as you're saying, that kind of thing exists. That kind of, and you hear some horror stories about how unscrupulous landlords cram people into sheds in their backyard and charge them a phenomenal amount of money, and they live dangerously and in very unhygienic conditions. But if these things can be acknowledged as something that's not beyond the pale, that's something that can work, and the Japanese, they have these sort of capsule hotels, where you rent a bed space, which is literally like a little slot in a whole bank of spaces, if where the salarymen live during the week before they go home to their families. I mean, I found those really quite tricky to imagine. I couldn't imagine doing it myself, but there are ways in which scales and conditions can be, it's not regulated, but it's more about how they might be kind of assimilated, and how people might have the mindset to kind of deal with this without being seen as something outside the system.
Yes, I think that's really interesting, and it makes so this phrase, this kind of bottom up housing, is as much to do with bottom up modes of legislation and regulation of production as it is to do with the design per se, which has to respond to a fairly stable set of values. Like residents like certain things. I mean, you're right, certain cultures, they're more comfortable living, for example, in temporary accommodation. Comfort is the wrong word, but they're more perhaps they're just more capable of doing it. And certain cultures are more comfortable in living in smaller spaces. I saw this when I lived in Korea, where we were provided, I was teaching English, and I was provided with my new wife, and I were provided with that makes me sound like I had a previous one. I didn't. We just got married. We're provided with what was a middle-class flat for a middle-class family. And it was a room. It was a single room, about 3.5 meters by about 4.5 meters, which included a kitchen and a bathroom in there as well. And we slept on the floor. They provided us very kindly with a bed, but that wasn't the normal way of things. So they could live very, very small, roll up their beds, sit on the floor to share food, put that away, and then do their exercise education and any work that they needed to do as well within that space. But what I really like about one of the other things I really like about this book is that you have attempted to get into this idea of the subjective, not the subjective, the kind of emotive and sensual content of home life. And you do this through this presentation of projects and presentation of discourse, of interviews and conversations, to try and unpack what is an incredibly, it is the most native form of architecture that all of us experience. It's what we know, it's our first environment. But at the same time, it's possibly the least properly discussed and analyzed. It's the least understood. It remains something that we sort of stop being rational about at the point of threshold. We sort of treat it in an incredibly intimate and private way. I mean, it is private space, obviously, but I like the way that you've done that in the book, that you've tried, and obviously the influence of your wife, Claire Meluish, the anthropologist, has probably been Meluish has been instrumental in this.
No, it's very I suppose it's kind of how we met and got together in a way. But you know, as you know, it's a cliche, but you as architects you have to be interested in everything, you know. And I'm not, you know, I'm interested in anthropology, and I can remember we had a tutor in my first year at school who introduced the subject of sociology to us, and anthropology, and we would, you know, the word, I think I heard the word ecology for the first time, and these were all new ideas to me, and I suppose that's what has been of interest to me. But not just that, you know, I'm interested in the whole kind of history of architecture, and you know, the great and the good, as well as the kind of ensemble of urban places and so on. But this idea of how, and in a way the book is like an assemblage, I would say, Ambrose. It's not, it was a privilege to do this book and have this invitation by the editors at UCL Press, Murray Fraser and Jonathan Hill, but because this is not even an attempt at putting a PhD together. They just said, just go for it, you know. And initially the invitation was to both Claire and myself, off the back of an exhibition I had in Copenhagen when I had a professorship there in 2009 at the academy. But Claire couldn't do it. She dropped out because she runs the urban lab at the Bartlett and just has no time to join. I'd had no time to join in, so I did it, and I suppose I took on this idea of interview. At Copenhagen, Claire had interviewed 10 clients, and the Danes thought that was very brave. We just published these unexpurgated texts, some of which is quite critical about me, and some of it was kind of viewed as psychotherapy almost. But when I took it on, I did it in a very basic way. I ended up, you know, somebody said, "Oh, you're a bit like Eamon Andrews, you know, this is your life." You know, I just asked people the most direct questions and put that down about, you know, their where they, you know, who their parents were and where they're from and what they did and all of that. And I just was very interesting to me to kind of bring this put this onto the page and juxtapose them. And it was a kind of method, I would say, of juxtaposition as a way of explaining or demonstrating almost that it's not all about me, and that it's other people's voices are important, and you know, how sometimes, however peripheral, they're still overlap and engage and influence the project. You know, I don't want to make any more claims for the method or the process. I'm not quite, you know, I just see it as being, it can be quite hit and miss. There's no kind of scientific process here. And I suppose that's where I may have mentioned James Clifford, and the American anthropologist whose predicament of culture I quote and refer to a lot, where, you know, Clifford talks about, you asked in your questions about ethnography, and I suppose my approach to ethnography is that it's again, it's partial, and it can be used and evolve through different kinds of practice, you know, art practice, and I'm interested in that. And Clifford talks about authority in ethnography, and ethnographic surrealism, and I suppose my interest in it has been about the latter. It's more like a kind of treating it as a part of a process of collage, and juxtaposition, and sometimes just initiating processes and not knowing quite why you're doing them, but bringing them together in a way that sort of sets off other things in motion. And that, and I think it can be, it works for me, and I think it works I see it work for a lot of people, you know. I do it in my teaching. I teach an M-Art studio. I have been teaching at London Met, but I'd been teaching at the AA before that. But I'm just by way of one quick example, well, I know you're running out of time, Ambrose, but I this idea of the representing research through drawing. I for about 3 years, I took students to the V&A Indian Miniatures room the day we met, and we looked at miniatures, and then we went into the field, the areas where we were studying, and they had to make drawings to scale, but they didn't have to all be at the same scale. And you make kind of, I was interested in critiquing the CGI, so the miniature offered a kind of response to how parallel projections might work, you know, whether planimetric or axonometric or isometric, but what was really important with them was that you could kind of describe narratives in them, because the miniatures always held, you know, a host of protagonists in the frame, and just because we wanted to say that, you know, make the point in a kind of anthropological sense that the person who was doing this had to place themselves in the frame too, to somehow demonstrate that the process is quite impure the moment you engage with a kind of group, you know, that the dynamic changes. And I suppose, not particularly coherently expressed, but it was this idea that one could talk about places, and through observation of people as well, and how you've seen them engage with those spaces. So it's a sort of form of survey. We spent a lot of time doing that, you know, and then that sometimes those drawings would take days and weeks to prepare, you know, and it allowed one to penetrate, you know, make drawings that you could look through the outside of the building into the interior, and you could establish importance of of different activities and things through the scale at which you present them. I thought these are things that, you know, one learned from the miniature, Persian miniature, you know, even the Chinese landscape painting. And so I that was a method that I'm still quite interested in.
I think it's it's very elegant to me. I mean, this idea, it's almost like in the book itself and the way that you express it, that what anthropology or an ethnographic approach to design enables is a reflexive and iterative practice, but also a sort of post-occupancy evaluation of the efficacy of what you've done, which I really think for architecture would be a great thing, because we do we do post-occupancy evaluations of sort of technical aspects of architecture. If you've done a kind of BREEAM excellent rated building, you can set up your sensors and your measurement techniques and tools, and then you can find out whether your building is as good as you claim it was. And it probably won't be, but you'll fudge the figures and it'll look great. But with the technique that you've described, it's actually a way of kind of really rounding off the design process, allowing the architect to find out really what it's like. And as you say, you know, it's sometimes you're going to end up in a situation where the client says rude things about you. But the other thing that seems to me is that this idea of Clifford's, and this idea of a sort of impure anthropology, is that you recognize in this way of describing buildings, of describing dwellings, the impact of your agency, your personhood in the context, you as the architect, even beyond the actions of designing a thing, have an instrumental impact on the context in which you're operating. And having people talk about that then becomes a way of recognizing that and deepening and enriching that anthropological study itself, which I think is an extremely elegant thing to do. I think it's, you know, I suppose it would be held within a kind of critical ethnographic practices now, rather than a kind of classical Levi Strauss kind of subterfuge hidden anthropologist who makes no mark but just observes like James Bond.
That's very interesting to put it that way. Yeah. But no, I mean, these things, you know, I see myself as a practitioner, you know, with a great desire to build things well, and you know, have done a few things, not many, and it's taken me a long time to I've taught for over many years. I've taught since the mid 80s, you know, but very hit and miss, and you know, mostly through practice and occasionally being invited to crit and so on. But I've taught more substantially at the AA in the 90s, early noughties, took a gap, and then I've been teaching at London Met for 9 years. I think I ran an M-Arch unit there. And it's, I think, only in the last decade would I say that I've kind of worked out a little bit about what I'd like to talk about with students. And I mean, you can talk about anything, Ambrose, as you know, and there are some great teachers who talk about things that are completely different to the things I like to talk about, but are wonderful teachers. I suppose the interest I've had, I suppose, it's also, apart from wanting to build beautifully and having a kind of great regard for the history of architecture and developing a connoisseurship around that, which I think we can't avoid, you know, in ways, but at the same time, wanting to bring together a critical position, which is overtly political as well, you know. I've almost tried to deal with that in the book in a very dumb way, you know, and I've said, you know, all architecture is political, and that we are, you know, whether we like it or not, you know, we have to acknowledge that and go with that, you know. And architecture generally is not something that's available to everybody, in the world.
Yeah.
And part of what we have to do is to make sure that everybody can have access to it, and this idea of places in which to live comfortably. I think talking about comfort is not a bad thing.
No.
Comfort is important to people who live in temperatures like we were suffering yesterday. I mean, I spent some time about 12 years ago doing a pro bono project for Article 25, a creche for the children of unmarried mothers in Maputo. I went there for 10 days and we were carrying out surveys where the temperatures were nearly 50 degrees, and people living in tiny reduced accommodation, which, because just impossible conditions. I knew I was all right because I knew I was going to go home shortly, but people live there all their lives, and their lives are shortened by the kind of environmental impact of what they are having to go through. That was a very salutary experience for me. It was very, very, very problematic to witness all of that. So I suppose the book is a kind of a plea to think about, I call it a new Green Deal, but and I talked about that kind of idea that the environment. We've had a social revolution, through the Russian constructivists, and before that, of course, through people like so William Morris and people like Robert Owen. But the environmental revolution, it hasn't been coming quick enough for us, I don't think. But I'm interested in that. The idea of comfort in a dwelling is so vital, when we're now having to kind of face up to these extremes of temperature and weather conditions.
Yes. And does that, if you've got time, I'd like to carry on talking for a bit, because the second kind of prompt that I sent you was this subtitle, which I mentioned before, which is Architecture for the Seaside, Middle England and the Metropolis. And there's an inversion here, and there's an intentional inversion away from this metropolitan-centric tendency in contemporary architecture and in contemporary discourse. And in contemporary media, and in the production and construction of policy, and in the way that the Royal Institute of British Architects operates, which is almost entirely London-centric, embarrassingly London-centric, if you don't mind me saying. I think I'm right in saying it's either 2 or 3 of the Sterling Prize winners over its entire life have not been London practices. I think it's the first one, Stephen Hodder, EMBT, and then maybe one from Ireland.
Really.
It's anyway. So we've got this idea that the city dominates the periphery, and you put the periphery first. And I think this is really. I'd love you to talk a little bit about the logic behind that.
Yeah, it's obviously I did it deliberately. We had a different title for the book when Claire and I were doing it, which was a much more kind of formal academic title, which kind of escapes me right at the moment. But when Claire dropped out, I took it. I felt I had a bit of license to become a bit more playful, because Claire is the academic in our relationship. I felt I had a bit more license to play with the way I talked about the work, and that's where the title came about. And and to talk about the seaside before the metropolis, and to include Middle England in a way that was kind of affectionate, pejorative, but affectionate as well. It's talking about a mindset, but then talking about Middle England as a landscape of some substance, I as an outsider, as a immigrant long ago, I'm a real Anglophile, and kind of the English landscape is an astonishing thing, I feel, because of the geology that's made it happen. So, but talking about, I mean, I talked about it in the book about the seaside. I mean, I also didn't want it to be, you know, the kind of image of the pre-post-war English seaside, you know, candy floss and sticks of rock and you know, saucy postcards and things. But this idea that the sea and the sea itself is you know, something like I think I mentioned, you call it primordial, and that, you know, it's where we all come from, and we need to kind of contemplate it with a great deal of respect, especially in terms of the way that we're having climate change being enacted, and that affects the seaside in a very powerful way. But at the same time, I did want to talk about the seaside as something that you said you live in Margate. That Margate is the first seaside town I visited when I came to live in England. I spent 2 weeks in a caravan with a family of friends of mine from school, and had a really interesting time in Margate. And this was, yeah, very, but it just this kind of the popular cultural idea of the seaside, and how one might not denigrate it, and I've, you know, and that the seaside has virtues, and it also has issues now, because a lot of the seaside towns have been, you know, going through a long period of decline, you know, probably since the 60s, and they, you know, they are suffering from economic decline, and that affects the kind of environment that has emerged around the seaside. And so I suppose I had the opportunity to enter the competition for Burnbeck Island at Weston-super-Mare. I was invited by Jonathan Vining, who was my collaborator, and I was a consultant to his company, White Young Green. And it was a project run by the local authority and Urban Splash. And we made a very playful proposal, which, you know, a very big building that was a very small island, and we nearly won. You know, it got second prize. I think, you know, they couldn't quite believe our proposal was proposing 1.2 million square feet of development. You know, I think Urban Splash had a budget of 18 million quid, which was only divulged at stage 2, you know, and this project would have cost 200 million or plus. But I mean, I think there are so many things afoot. You know, the wider context, you know, the project we made was places in which to live. It had hotel, it had all the attendant seaside functions and so on. But it was in the context of some very large scale initiatives that were taking place in the Severn Estuary. I mean, you got Hinkley Down, the nuclear power station was being built there, literally within 10 miles. And they were proposing at one point a Severn barrage, which was a very interesting scenario for making a barrage, which allowed that allow the ecology to somehow be sustained and not destroyed. So we thought the scale of our project would chime with these, as well as the kind of headland at Weston, which is a very interesting ecological site. But no, I mean, I'm kind of optimistic about the seaside, and wanting to offer something that could be an opportunity to play with some new ideas about how buildings might be made there. We worked with some brilliant consultants. We had Atelier One, Aaron Chadwick for the structure, and Bill Watts of Max Fordham's, who's one of their senior directors, came and worked with us on the environmental aspects, and White Young Green's own landscape people helped us invent a kind of a structure that operated in a way that, you know, we were sort of playing the game, maybe it's a postmodern moment, you know, replicating the flora and the flora and the landscape of the headland in a structure, and at the, so it to all appearances from some distance it looked like a large rock, but at close up it was obviously a building and inhabited, and I quite like that aspect of it. I thought that was offering something new to a seaside context, and Bill's thought was, hey, this, you know, it's we could use it for a data center, and, you know, these are something that are new on the horizon, are happening, you know, in remote places. Why can't they be in the shape of large rocks off the off the coast of the British Isles? And so you could use the heat generated by the data center. These were kind of almost zero carbon in its kind of in its scenario, because you're using the heat from the data center to power everything else in the building. And I think we had one wind generator set in the Bristol Channel, and there were two islands nearby. So we were sort of we were playing that other architectural game of mimicry, steep home and flat home in the channel there. And I suppose just trying to raise the conversation about the seaside without patronizing it.
Yeah. And I mean the British seaside, which is something that until quite recently, until COVID really, until perhaps the last 20 years, we've turned our backs on. And it's quite funny as an island people, with our history of seafaring and discovery from the sea, we've forgotten about these places. It's again interesting about being in Margate, particularly in this hot weather, is its relationship, its dependency on the metropolitan. And there seems to me to be something, oh, hold on, I'm about to run out of battery, and that would be a disaster. Here we go, I'm back on. There seems to be this proposal that you made does this wonderful synthetic thing which the British seaside had always done. I mean, if you go to Southend over the other side of the Thames estuary from us, they've got a pier there that's 1.5 miles long. So big infrastructure is not alien to that context, and wild, humorous, witty, spectacular things are not unknown either. So it struck me as being a rather elegant proposal, to be quite honest, and to make it look like a little island. I mean, couldn't be better. But this relationship to the city, and to recognizing, in a way, the way I read it and the way I read your subtitle, particularly for this context, for this island, this archipelago, is that the logic of the city actually depends on the coastal identity of the place, and that to fully properly understand the city, you have to understand the places where the city dweller goes for their recreation, for their leisure. And they've been coming out here in their tens of thousands since lockdown, because they haven't been able to go abroad. And they've discovered that actually the beaches are nice, and the weather's quite good, and the sea is a bit chilly, but a bit parky, but it's all right once you're in, and so on.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, you know, one's aware, you know, especially with Margate and the North Kent seaside towns. I mean, and their relation to London, you know, and that interaction was really important, you know, in the 19th century and right up, I would say, probably right up to the 60s, and I think the discovery of the seaside by the metropolis, if you like, probably occurred, late 18th century, something like that. People went to take, went to the seaside, for therapeutic reasons, and not just to get into the water, but just for the air and so on. But that was a sort of invention about then, I think, and it's it's I think it's a kind of the discovery, or maybe there's a rediscovery of that through this kind of period during COVID, and the pandemic, where people are not going away because one, travel was restricted, or air travel, but there's that aspect, and I suppose the relationship to the sort of the coast nearby is something that is just also environmentally a much easier, better thing to think about environmentally, because you can get on the train, or and you're there, and I think that's it. Maybe it's all built in, stitched into this picture that we're evolving, hopefully, where we can engage with the local more effectively, and in a way that we don't feel that we're being diminished or cheated, that we can't go on holiday to Thailand or Bali, and we can get the same delights and pleasures from going to Margate or Weston-super-Mare. Really, I seriously believe in that, that the English seaside is wonderful, and so again multifarious in what it has to offer us.
Yes. I'm going to stop it there, but I just wanted to say the whole book and conversation with you has been lovely to hear you talk what I would perhaps describe as a very peripatetic kind of architectural imagination of traveling around and encountering things, and the book really describes that very elegantly, and I'm very grateful for you spending so much time talking to me about it. So thank you very much.
No, Ambrose, thank you. It's been a real pleasure to meet you and talk to you, and thank you for your generosity in inviting me, and this conversation has been good fun.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Lovely stuff. Thanks to Pierre for a great conversation, for his time and his input and his patience, as well as for a copy of his 2018 book, San Salvatore, published by Pattern Book Press. Please see the podcast description for links to Pierre's practice and other recordings he's made. And don't forget to like, subscribe, follow and share AS for Architecture everywhere you go now. Cheers.